A while ago I made a video looking on what happened to the Starfleet personnel of Deep Space Nine in Apocrypha and kept aside the rest of the cast for a part 2 video, so hello, I'm Rick and here it is. As before, this list is drawn primarily from the canon of the shows, but we will then explore the Apocrypha to see where their paths could take them in a variety of continuities. To begin with then, let's look at the fate of the station's Chief of Security, Constable Odo. With the ending of the series and the conclusion of the Dominion War, Odo returned to the Great Link to share both the cure to the Section 31 plague that was afflicting them and his experiences among the solids. This was a condition of the Treaty of Bajor, and in no small way the deciding factor in the ending of the war, and here he would remain, reintroducing some compassion and mercy to the totalitarian Dominion. However, the Dominion committed atrocities using fear and control as its weapons, and it left a bitter taste for many of its subjugated or enthralled worlds. If the Dominion wanted to avoid reprisals, change would be a slow process and not come easily to the monolithic power. Odo's morality and viewpoints were disseminated among the other changelings, and would be the beginnings of a gradual reform, and effectively a lifelong work for Odo. According to books and even the online setting, he did make several trips through the Alpha-Gamma wormhole to revisit DS9 in an official capacity as an ambassador of the Dominion. He was selected for the role not only for his ties to the solids, but because he was still regarded as something of an outsider even among his own people. But he used his position to talk around a small group of Vorta and Jem'Hadar to begin to build his vision of a more peaceful Dominion. These included characters such as a new Wayun, despite the supposed loss of his DNA template, the young Jem'Hadar he had returned one time in DS9, and an individual who was born free of the Ketracel addiction. Although it is nice to think that with Odo returning to the Great Link, everything would suddenly be hunky-dory and the Dominion would see the error of their ways, the slow change is a far more realistic outcome, even among those as interconnected as the Changelings. Remember, the founders were motivated to form the Dominion out of fear of their own safety, and that is a tough thing to overcome. Next up, let's look at the arch-nemesis of Odo, the magnificent Quark. When we leave him, he is still running his bar on DS9, although he is now the brother to the Grand Nagus, which affords him greater status and opens up new opportunities for him. Among many of his new business ventures was the addition of Starfleet ship model kits of all things, but by far the bigger deal was the growth of Quark's bar into a franchise with one known chain on the mercantile planet of Freecloud, as well as on Quaylor 2 and the Federation Starbase 25. Despite these legitimate expansions of his portfolio, he retained one hand in the more nefarious schemes as ever, and his name carried weight in certain underworld circles. This is as well as the apocryphal additions that Quark's bar on DS9 became an official embassy of Ferenginar, and he ended up making enough latinum by 2409 to be able to afford his very own moon, something that he had been pining for ever since he found out his cousin owned one. I have no idea what he does with it, or what is there, but he owns one now, so perhaps he can finally sleep a little easier. Speaking of Quark's family, we have Rom and Lita. These two are the Nagus and First Lady of the Ferengi, and believe it or not, Rom is actually not bad at the role. He himself has proven to not have the lobes for business, as it were, but having accepted that, most of what he does is not motivated by personal financial gain, but the betterment of his people. He compensates for his lack of experience by surrounding himself with the advice of individuals such as his brother, Lita, who has a rather cynical and shrewd approach after being a double girl for so many years, and financial savants such as his mother Ishka, Zek, and Pel. You may have noticed that most of his advisors are female, which, until Rom, was frowned upon in Ferengi society, but this is one of the first reforms he makes. His argument is quite sound, when his moral pleas fall on deaf ears. He simply states that the Ferengi have hamstrung themselves for long enough by saying that half their people cannot perform business, and imagine how much more capital they could bring in if they all worked. Now, not all of his choices are popular, but in the tales of Star Trek Online, his position is secured when he manages to broker the most profitable deal in Ferengi history. Basically, the Cardassians find themselves quite adept at rebuilding their infrastructure and fleets after the war, and continue to produce high-quality ships, which the Ferengi have the exclusive rights to sell. So while Rom's rule as Nagus was fraught with doubters, he had surrounded himself with people who would watch out for him, and believed in the newer, fairer Ferengi he was trying to build, bolstered by the occasional deal that even his detractors could not deny was in the best interests of his people. Next up, let's look at the humble Garrick. He returned to Cardassia and aids in the rebuilding of his civilization after the literal decimation of his people at the hands of the Dominion. One of the final orders that the female founder had given was to kill all the Cardassians, and the Dominion, genetically bound to obey, had begun that order before they were finally stopped. Sources on what he got up to vary depending on the story you read, but most have him eventually end up in a position of some importance and sway, leading in some form. He spends time simply trying to help rebuild, and attends the occasional rally to listen to the rhetoric of the Cardassian people, and he eventually comes to the conclusion that those still in power are attempting to rebuild the regime as it was, despite it being what got them into this mess. So he resolves to take a more active role in politics. His efforts included petitioning the Federation for aid where possible, and he took on the role of an ambassador to the UFP. There was a lot of opposition from the old guard of the government that he faced, but thanks to his lifetime as a spy and agent of the Obsidian Order, he survived multiple assassination attempts, as he basically knew all the tricks. Eventually he ascended to the position of Castellan, the leader of the Cardassian Union, for a time. His time in office would see him pursue the extremist organisation the True Way, and an in-depth investigation of all the issues with the Cardassian occupation of Bajor. Essentially, like Odo, he faced an uphill battle in altering the direction of his formerly antagonistic government into a more peaceful way of life, and it would take him a long time. He does not remain Castellan forever, eventually stepping back as a councillor, but the changes he managed to instigate continue, with him supporting them from the shadows. Keiko O'Brien, in fact, has a large part in the rebuilding of Cardassia, with her being a critical figure in the Andak project to rebuild the planet's long-neglected and now crippled agriculture. She and Miles move there together for a time, and she works alongside the Union to develop their own sustainability, preventing them from reverting back to conquest and occupation for their spoils. Meanwhile, Jake continues on his path as a reporter and writer. He ends up purchasing his own small shuttlecraft of Bajoran origin called the Venture, and used that to travel for a while before exploring Bajor and meeting a woman named Azini Karina, who he fell in love with and married shortly thereafter. The connections he had made in his time aboard DS9 continued to serve him well, and he conducted several high-profile interviews with Federation, Cardassian, Klingon, and more individuals, including unearthing the old Section 31 files that covered the clandestine tale of what happened to Trip Tucker in Apocrypha. He eventually even gets his own works published in a novel compendium called Anslem, which goes on to be regarded with high acclaim. Basically, he gets a similar outcome to the alternate future we saw in The Visitor, but with a bit less bittersweetness, if that is a word. Cassidy Yates, in the meantime, returned to Bajor's Kendra Valley, where she began construction of her and Benjamin Sisko's planned home. In the books, their daughter was named Rebecca J. Sisko, and Benjamin returned in time to be there for the birth. Her life in the books goes on to be fraught with drama, kidnappings and threats against her and her family, stemming from Sisko's association as the emissary. But during all of this, she goes on to find a way to expand her freight business, as seen in 2399, when there is a billboard advertising Cassidy Yates's interstellar freights, showing that she maintained her venture in cargo. Whether or not she takes an active role as a captain or a more administrative role is up in the air in canon. Either that, or she has a career change to medical and hops into another universe entirely. Now, I'm going to include Alexander Rozhenko here. However, in Apocrypha, he has a rather tragic end, with his father outlasting him in the online continuity. And we see an alternate future version of him in canon with Kimtar, who had returned through time travel in an attempt to alter his future, a future where Worf was slain in reprisal for Alexander's attempts to bring about a more peaceful empire. The last we see of Alexander, however, he had enlisted in the KDF and was assigned to the Yavang as weapons officer. In Apocrypha, he worked alongside his father, while Worf is the ambassador to the Federation, eventually inheriting his position. By 2392, switching to the online timeline now, he had married Ba'en and had a son of his own, Davak. He travelled to Earth and held a teaching position there for some time, after stepping down from his ambassadorial status, but he was eventually taken back to Rura Pente by the Empire for spreading his philosophy of peace, a similar path to his future self. While there, he adopted the alias of Kimtar in a paradoxical attempt to honour the Klingon he had met in the past, unaware that it was in fact him. However, he is killed in an attempt to uncover Tal Shiar manipulations within House Torg in 2409. So, this is the fate of those I left behind from the last video. Morn, of course, goes on to frequent many baths across the galaxy, citing deep wisdom and ancient lore to any who will listen. What do you think of these outcomes? I definitely prefer some to others. Garrick's, for example, seems perfect for him, acting in a capacity to serve his people while utilising his skill set that has seemingly been at odds with his morality for some time. I'm not a great fan of the timeline that sees Alexander dead, however, but for good or ill, most of this is still unwritten in the canon. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you back for another video, and until then, I've been Rick. So long, and goodbye.